Hello, welcome back to Only One Stories. My name is Bonnie, and I'm here to tell you another terrible story. On this channel, I really like to talk about just stories that interest me. A lot of times that's true crime. Sometimes it's just other stories that come up in the news that I find interesting to talk about. So today I'm going to talk all about the case of Maura Murray, who disappeared in 2004. It's one of those cases that is so interesting to me because of the mystery surrounding what happened. Maura was born in 1982, which is really close to when I was born. So I feel this kind of a connection in a way to Maura, even though I obviously never met her. I was able to speak with her sister, Julie, recently through TikTok, and she very kindly took the time to answer a lot of my questions that I had about this case. I've listened to podcasts, I've read articles, I've watched documentaries on this case. It's so interesting, but at the same time, it's so frustrating. So let's just get right into it. So Maura grew up in Massachusetts, and I asked her sister Julie if she could describe her sister for us. And she said that Maura was extremely smart, athletic, really funny, and most importantly, she was humble and a really kind person. She also said she wanted people to remember that her sister was a real human being. She had a real life. She was, her little sister. She's not this character. And that's really important for me to remember when talking about these true crime stories, because it's easy to turn it into a story with characters. But the truth is that Maura was a real person, and her family is still affected by this disappearance. To this day, almost 18 years has gone by. So Maura went to West Point and she started studying there, and she was following in her sister Julie's footsteps. But after she was there for about 2 years, she decided to switch. It wasn't what she wanted, so she switched to the University of Massachusetts to study nursing. And she was in her junior year, February 9th of 2004, when she disappeared. So Maura was 21 years old. February 9th was a Monday. She did not tell anybody what her plans were, as far as anybody knows. So again, it adds to the mystery of what happened to Maura. What were her plans? What was her mindset like the day of her disappearance? At some point during that day, Maura emailed her professors at the university, her nursing supervisor, to say that there had been a death in her family and that she would need a few days off for bereavement. It turns out that that was not the truth. There was no death in her family. Perhaps she did this because she needed a few days away and she wanted to sort of explain her absence in advance. At some point also, she had searched up on her computer directions to a few different locations up north, specifically Burlington, Vermont, and the Berkshires. She also had made a few phone calls looking into booking some accommodations there. Her dorm room at the University of Massachusetts was actually all packed up into boxes. So at some point during that day, she packed up almost all of her belongings. She took the artwork off the walls. It looked like she was planning on leaving, but she never told anybody about this plan. She also packed up some of her belongings into her car. Some clothes, her toiletries, a couple of, her college textbooks, and she left the campus at around 3:30 p.m. She left in her black 1996 Saturn sedan, and she went directly to an ATM machine. They found some surveillance footage from the machine to show that she was alone. It looked like she was alone in the car. She took out about $280, and then she purchased some alcohol at a liquor store. We don't know what happened between 4:30 and 7:30. We know that she drove north. She took several hours and she drove into the White Mountains of New Hampshire. The last known phone call that she made was at 4:30 p.m. and that was to check her voicemail messages. At 7:27 p.m., a local resident that lived nearby heard a crash. and looked out the window and saw Maura's car that had been in an accident. So she was driving along Route 112, which was a fairly windy road. The weather conditions weren't great. It was snowy out. It was getting dark. And she hit a snowbank. She was going around like a hairpin turn, and she drove her car she lost control and she hit a snowbank. The resident that heard and sort of looked out and saw this accident phoned 911 to let them know what had happened. Another resident that was driving by a few minutes later was driving his bus. His name was Butch Atwood, and he drove by and he saw and he stopped and he spoke with Maura. And Butch is one of the last known people to actually ever speak to Maura. He offered her help because he could tell that she was cold and shivering. She was standing outside of her vehicle. He said that it didn't appear that she was injured. He couldn't see any blood or anything on her. But she refused the help. She said, "No, thank you. Please don't call the police. I've already phoned AAA." So he left. But when he got home a few minutes later, he decided to go ahead and call the police anyways, because he realized that it was such a rural area that didn't have any cell phone reception. And he was worried about that. So he thought, he didn't really think that she could have phoned AAA. It turned out that she didn't. So he called and reported the accident as well. A few minutes later, so 7 to 10 minutes later after the first 911 call was placed, the first police officer appeared on the scene. And he found Maura's 1996 Saturn sedan with the doors locked. Both airbags were deployed. There was a crack in the front windshield, and the front of the car was damaged. And Maura had disappeared. Again, this adds to the mystery of what happened to Maura, because there's only a few minutes between when the bus driver last spoke with her and when the police officer arrived on the scene. So in those few minutes, what happened to Maura? Now, the bus driver, Butch Atwood, was questioned by police. He was given two polygraph tests. He failed the first one, but he passed the second one. And when I asked Julie about this, she said that he was never a suspect. In fact, there was never any named suspect in this case ever. So was Butch telling the truth? Was he involved? The family doesn't believe so. The police don't believe so. Also, the police found a rag stuffed in the tailpipe of Maura's car. We have no idea why. And again, that could be a clue, maybe to, the disappearance. We don't know. But it's just kind of a strange added clue. Inside of her car, the police officer found a damaged box of wine and an empty beer bottle, some CDs, a pair of gloves, and some printed out directions to possibly where Maura was heading in Burlington, Vermont. Maura's family is frustrated and was disappointed in the police's inaction right at the beginning of this case, because in those few moments, that first police officer, they could have made such a difference if they had immediately started searching for Maura, who was a vulnerable person. She was possibly intoxicated, we don't know, but that was a possibility that they thought about. She was obviously upset. She was in an area that she was unfamiliar with. It was cold, it was dark, and she was probably out there walking alone. And the police didn't do a search right away. They didn't actually inform the family until 36 hours after this initial crash. So nothing really happened that first day. Police did report that they didn't see any footprints in the snow, and there was no sign of her. So when the family was finally informed on Tuesday, the police called Kathleen, who was Maura's older sister, and the police notified her. She, of course, called and notified her family, the rest of her family, and told them that the police had said that Maura's car was found and that she was hours up north. The family was confused and panicked right away. On the Wednesday, Maura's father, Fred, made his way to New Hampshire, and he went straight to the police and said, I want to join the search efforts to find Maura. And he was disappointed to find out that they hadn't really started much of a search at all. It wasn't until February 11th, on the Wednesday, that they finally did start the search efforts, and the New Hampshire Fish and Game, as well as the family and some other people, started to actually actively search for Maura. They used some dogs to track down the scent. So they used some gloves that Maura had in the car, and they used it, and the dogs were able to track her scent about 100 miles down the road. And then it kind of just stopped. The scent disappeared, leading a lot of people to speculate that she was able to get a ride. Somebody stopped. Somehow she got into another vehicle. And from there, we have no idea what happened. Now, at the time of this disappearance in 2004, so many people immediately got interested in this case. Facebook was only a few days old, and forums started up, and people who were interested in true crime and interested in trying to, solve cases, they immediately started talking about all the possibilities. Unfortunately, with awareness and all of the positive things that came along with this, sudden attention to her case, came a lot of misinformation, a lot of speculation that was spread around, and that did not help the case at all. So the family continued to try to search. Fred, her father, went every weekend almost to go and search, a lot of times by himself, and he just searched that area near the crash site. The family also went to different areas in Vermont, seeing if there was any way that Maura found a way to reach her location. Perhaps they could find some clues there. Fred and the family really, really wanted this case to be more actively searched. So in 2006, Fred petitioned the court for the police to release the records to the family, all of the records from the case. And the police pushed back, saying that this is still an ongoing, active case, and that they didn't want to release anything that could possibly harm the investigation, I suppose. Eventually, they did release some of the records to the family. However, they were heavily redacted, so it didn't really help the family out. There was a lot of local rumors as well as to what happened to Maura. And one of the rumors that the family found out about was that a lot of people in the area thought that Maura was possibly buried in the basement of a local house. Finally, in 2019, the police actually went and took cadaver dogs to this one particular home. And these cadaver dogs alerted in the basement near to this crash site. Fred and his family had really, really high hopes that Maura would finally be found. Eventually, they finally excavated the basement, and the family thought, this is it. The police said they were going to do a press conference, but it turned out to be nothing at all. These false alarms, these, trying to get your hopes up. You don't want to find Maura in these conditions. However, just the unknown, not knowing what happened to her, was so difficult, and still is so difficult for this family. So after, people speculated about Maura being buried in this basement in the concrete, they determined that there was no connection to Maura's case. In 2021, again, there was a tip that there was human remains found. And the human remains were actually 25 miles from the crash site in Loon Mountain. So once again, the family had these hopes of maybe they would find that these bone fragments would be connected back to Maura. They did testing, and it was determined that there was no connection to Maura at all. Maura's family is still committed to finding out what happened to her. I think, and I've heard this from a lot of missing people's families who are just left with the unknown. It's so difficult. Everybody wants to know what happened. Any little piece of evidence could help solve this case. Even though it's been 18 years since Maura went missing, there's still hope that somebody will come forward or some piece of evidence will be found that will lead to these answers for her family. There have been so many theories spread online about what possibly happened to Maura. So I'm going to go through some of them, as well as talking about what the family thinks happened. One of the theories is that Maura possibly was able to make it to her destination. She chose to run away, that she ran away and she started a new life somewhere. Some people have speculated, maybe she started a new life in Canada. However, her family highly doubts this. First of all, there's never been any sightings of Maura anywhere in the United States or in Canada. Also, it was so not in her character to do something like this. She never would have stayed away this long without having any contact with her family. While it's possible, I don't think that is what happened. Another possibility is that Maura got lost in the woods. Possibly when she realized that the police were going to be involved, maybe she panicked, possibly she was intoxicated, or just she might have even had a head injury from the car accident, and maybe she ran into the woods and succumbed to the elements. Or she may have taken her own life. That's another theory that the police initially thought was, possible, was that she had intended on taking her own life. However, there's no evidence to suggest that. But also, there have been so many searches done. Initially, they did the searching, but then again in the July of 2004, once the snow had melted, they did another search of the whole area, and they have done many, many subsequent searches of the surrounding area. So while it's possible that maybe she just did pass away in the woods, whether it was intentional or not, or an accident, there have been no signs of her clothing, any of the things that she brought with her, any of her property, nothing to suggest that this happened. Another theory, and this is the one that her family believes happened, is that there was foul play involved. There was a crime, and someone possibly picked her up and took her life. This is so difficult because there was such a small window for this to have happened, but her family thinks it's the most likely thing that happened, that she was in this car accident. The bus driver spoke to her. The bus driver drove off. And between that time and when the police arrived, those few minutes, possibly only 5 minutes or so, Maura was maybe walking down the road and another vehicle came and stopped and took her. I mean, it's such an awful thing to think of. But if that's the case, then someone out there must know something. Somebody must know what happened to Maura. Some web sleuths have suggested that there was more to it, that she had completely planned this out and had a tandem driver with her. Somebody was driving alongside of her or, behind her to help her to her destination, or is planning on going with her to her destination. And they saw that, she had gotten into this accident and picked her up, and they could both continued on to some other location. Again, there's no evidence of that. My hope is that Maura Murray's family will get some peace soon by finding out what happened to Maura, and hopefully be able to bring her remains and bury them with her family, because they deserve that. They deserve to know what happened. Thank you so much for joining me on Only One Stories. If you have any story suggestions for me, please let me know in the comments below. And if you haven't already, go ahead and like and subscribe if you want. And I will see you next time.